Imagine opening an ancient sacred text, right? You're expecting to find this elevated spiritual guidance, and instead you are just hit with a dizzying list. I mean, it jumps straight from funeral etiquette into a very specific menu of acceptable meats, and then boom, suddenly drops you into the deep end of tax law and financial management.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in all at once.
It really is. At first glance, it feels entirely chaotic. But today, we're going to discover how those seemingly bizarre instructions were actually this cohesive masterclass in building a distinct identity. Welcome, everyone. And before we even begin today, I just want to offer a quick blessing. May God bless your day today, and may He bless the week ahead of you, wherever you are and whatever you're facing. It is so good to have you here with us for this deep dive.
It really is great to be here. And we are unpacking Deuteronomy chapter 14 today. We'll be relying pretty heavily on the insights from two incredibly thorough sources, the Holman and the NAA Study Bibles. Because, I mean, for a modern reader, diving into this chapter can feel like looking at just a completely random assortment of rules.
Oh, absolutely. Like a grocery list mixed with a legal code.
Exactly.
But our mission today isn't just to, read off that ancient list. Our goal is to uncover the underlying why behind these regulations, because as we pull apart these ancient laws about mourning, diet, and money, we're going to find a highly structured blueprint for creating a deeply compassionate and completely distinct society.
So true.
So let's just jump right in. The chapter starts with an intense graphic prohibition regarding grief. It tells the Israelites, do not cut your bodies or shave the front of your head for the dead.
Right, which is a striking way to open a chapter that is predominantly going to focus on food and agricultural economics.
Yeah, it seems so out of place.
It does. But the cultural context here is vital. Both the Holman and the NAA Study Bibles point out that physical mutilations like gashing the skin, tearing out hair, or shaving the forehead were deeply entrenched pagan and Canaanite practices of the time.
Wait, so this wasn't just like individual people being overcome by personal sorrow and lashing out?
No, not at all. This was a formalized, structured way of mourning in that broader, ancient Near Eastern culture.
Oh, wow. So the surrounding nations did this intentionally as a ritual.
Yeah, precisely. The underlying thought process, according to our sources, was that by physically harming yourself, you might actually gain the sympathy of the gods. You know, you had to bleed to show them you were really grieving.
I see.
Or, in some pagan traditions, spilling your own blood was thought to somehow restore a broken cosmic balance after a death in the community.
That is wild. That's the core of it, though, isn't it? Ancient pagan deities were often viewed as capricious or distant.
Very distant.
You had to go to these extreme, painful lengths just to get their attention, especially in matters of life and death. But the text here in Deuteronomy just stops the Israelites in their tracks. It explicitly forbids this behavior.
And it gives a specific reason, right?
Yeah. Because they are children of the Lord and a holy people, they don't need to mutilate themselves to get their God's attention or sympathy. He's already with them.
It's such a radical shift in perspective for that era.
You know, it reminds me of a foreign embassy. Like, an embassy maintains the distinct laws, culture, and practices of its homeland, while situated right in the middle of a completely different country.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. And it doesn't do this just to be contrarian or to, rebel against the host nation. It does it to establish and maintain its true identity. So by telling Israel not to blend in with the surrounding cultural trends of grief, they're acting like an embassy of a different kingdom. They are establishing their identity.
Yeah, that is a much more accurate framework than just seeing it as a list of don'ts. The word holy essentially means set apart for a specific purpose.
Set apart, right.
Israel is supposed to be distinct from the nations around them, demonstrating a totally different understanding of who God is. And that boundary of holiness, well, it applies to everything they do.
Which brings us to an important transition in the text, I think.
Exactly. The physical boundaries they observe on the outside of their bodies, like refusing to cut their skin when they mourn, naturally extend to the physical boundaries of what they put inside their bodies. How they mourn and what they consume are both profound public markers of their identity.
Which brings us to the menu. The famous rules of clean and unclean animals.
Here we go.
Yeah, we're talking about the regulations where land animals must have split hooves and chew the cud, and water animals must have fins and scales. Now, I feel like the modern tendency is to view everything through a scientific or medical lens.
Oh, absolutely. We always want to do that.
We assume these rules must have been like an early version of the FDA. Avoiding trichinosis in pork or staying away from bottom feeders to prevent food poisoning.
It is an incredibly popular theory today. We naturally want to project our modern scientific priorities back onto ancient texts. But the NLA Study Bible emphasizes a really crucial point here. These laws were not based on ancient hygiene or physical health. The text and the historical study notes just do not support the health code theory. These were purely theological boundaries.
Yeah, the NWA note specifically points out that these animals aren't considered unclean because they're inherently dirty or diseased, right?
Right.
They are declared unclean by God purely to illustrate Israel's separation from other nations. Just as God separated Israel from the rest of the world, their diet was separated into distinct categories. It served as this practical, repetitive reminder.
At every single meal.
Exactly. 3 times a day, they were reminded, you are a set-apart people.
The daily repetition is the key. It wove their theology into the most mundane, routine aspects of human survival. But it's also where readers often encounter a bit of a stumbling block.
Oh, right, the biological hiccup.
Yeah, that's the one.
The Holman study notes bring up this really interesting technical detail in the text. When listing the unclean animals, the text specifically mentions the hare, or the rabbit, and says it's unclean because it chews the cud but doesn't have a split hoof.
Right.
Now, modern biology tells us a rabbit does not actually chew the cud. It's not a ruminant animal with multiple stomach chambers like a cow or a sheep. So, did the ancient texts just make a scientific mistake here?
It's a great question, and the Holman Notes introduced this term, phenomenological language, to explain it.
Phenomenological language, meaning describing the rabbit based on how it looks to the naked eye rather than its microscopic internal biology.
The study Bibles back you up on that completely. Phenomenological language is all about human observation. And honestly, we use it all the time today without even realizing it.
Like what?
Well, we constantly talk about how the sun rises and the sun sets, right? Even though we know scientifically that the Earth is rotating on its axis.
Oh, right.
We aren't making a scientific error when we say the sun goes down. We are just describing the phenomenon as we experience it.
That makes perfect sense. So an ancient Israelite looking at a rabbit sees it constantly moving its jaw from side to side. It looks exactly like a cow chewing its cud.
Exactly. And the Holman Note explains that God was accommodating the ancient Israelites' pre-scientific understanding. The ancient world didn't use, Linnaean taxonomy to classify animals by internal digestive tracts.
Right, they weren't dissecting them in a lab.
No, they categorized animals by observable behavior and habitat. The text wasn't trying to serve as an exhaustive biology textbook for the 21st century.
It was using observable, everyday categories that the original audience already understood to teach a lesson about spiritual obedience.
Yeah. And the Holman Note beautifully describes this accommodation as an act of grace and love from God, making his revelation accessible to them in their own context.
I really appreciate that perspective. He met them exactly where they were, looking at the animals exactly how they saw them. So understanding that these food laws are about honoring God's order and not just a primitive health code, the chapter then moves to a law that specifically honors the sanctity of God's creation itself.
And things get very specific here regarding animals that die of natural causes.
Yeah, walk us through that.
So the text outlines 3 distinct degrees of separation in the society regarding these naturally disposed animals.
Right.
First, you have the Israelites, the holy people.
Okay.
They are strictly forbidden from eating an animal that died naturally. This is presumably because the blood hasn't been drained properly, which violates other foundational laws about the sanctity of blood.
Right, blood is sacred.
Exactly. Then there's the second tier, the resident foreigner, like the immigrant living currently among them. The text actually says the Israelite can give the dead animal to them to eat.
Wow, okay.
And then the third tier is the outside foreigner, the passing stranger or traveling merchant. The Israelite is permitted to actually sell the animal to them.
No, wait. If this were a health code, they wouldn't give the meat to anyone. I mean, if it was toxic, giving it to your neighbor or selling it to a merchant would be completely unethical.
Right, it would be terrible.
But they are allowed to distribute it. So what is the underlying logic behind giving it to the resident foreigner for free, but charging the passing merchant?
It comes down to ancient economics and social responsibility. Resident foreigners were part of the local community's social fabric. They often didn't own land and were highly vulnerable, so providing them with food, even meat that didn't meet Israel's strict ceremonial standards, was an act of charity and community support.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Passing merchants, on the other hand, were engaged in standard commerce. They were businessmen moving through the area. Selling to them was just standard trade. The meat was perfectly fine for human consumption. It just didn't meet the ceremonial holiness standards required for the Israelites.
That clears up the economic mechanism perfectly. It's a boundary marker for the Israelites, a charitable allowance for the resident, and a commercial asset for the trader.
Exactly.
And then we arrive at the mother's milk rule, the famous verse. Do not boil a kid, a young goat, in its mother's milk.
The NWA's study Bible provides some incredible insight into this seemingly random culinary restriction.
Because it does sound totally random.
It really does.
Yeah.
But historically, this was very likely a polemic, like a direct argument against a specific Canaanite religious practice. There is evidence suggesting Canaanites might have used this exact concoction in agricultural fertility rituals.
Really? Like a spell.
Kind of, hoping to magically persuade their gods to bless their flocks and crops. So on a historical level, it's another boundary line. Don't imitate pagan magic. But on a much deeper philosophical level, the note explains that doing this is a direct affront to God as the creator.
You know, the poetry of this rule is striking. Milk is the very substance designed by the Creator to nurture, to sustain, and to give life to an offspring. It is quite literally the vehicle of life.
That's right.
So to take that life-giving substance and use it as the boiling pot to cook that exact offspring, it is a total violation of the natural order. It twists something designed for life into an instrument of death. Viewing it this way shifts these dietary laws from being merely restrictive to being profoundly respectful of life itself.
It transforms the law into an ethical statement. It teaches the Israelites to respect the boundary between life and death. Even when they're consuming meat, which requires the end of an animal's life, they must not mock the life-giving processes of the animal kingdom that God designed. There has to be this ingrained reverence for the sanctity of life, even in the kitchen.
That's a stark contrast to how disconnected modern consumers often are from the origins of our food. But honoring the sanctity of God's physical creation doesn't stop at the dinner plate, though. The text seamlessly transitions to honoring him with the yield of that creation, crops, wealth, and the tithe.
The final section of Deuteronomy 14 covers the laws of tithing. And to really understand this, we have to completely detach ourselves from modern conceptions of what a tithe is.
Yeah, because today, when we hear tithe, we usually think of a solemn religious duty, writing a check at a quiet church service, or setting up a recurring auto draft online.
Exactly, it is treated with a very somber tone. But reading through the logistics in this ancient text, the reality of how they practice it is surprising.
Surprising is an understatement.
Right. The foundational rule is that they have to bring a tenth of their crops and flocks to the central sanctuary. But the text provides a massive logistical loophole for distance.
And thank goodness, because the ancient world didn't have refrigerated trucks or paved highways. Hauling a tenth of an entire farm's grain, wine, oil, and livestock across a desert to its central location, I mean, that was a logistical nightmare.
Almost impossible for some.
Yeah.
So the text recognizes this reality. It says, if the journey is too long, you can convert your tithe into cash. You tie the silver to your hand, you travel to the central sanctuary, and then verse 26 says you can use that money to buy whatever your heart desires.
Wait. Whatever your heart desires.
Yes. It specifically lists cattle, sheep, wine, and strong drink. And then you're commanded to consume it there in the presence of the Lord and rejoice with your household.
So instead of a somber drop in the collection plate, this text is essentially mandating a massive celebratory barbecue funded by your tithe with strong drink.
It is a remarkable paradigm shift, isn't it? The NWA study notes confirm that the tithe in this specific context wasn't about depriving yourself. The explicit purpose stated in the text was to learn to fear and trust God. And they accomplished that through a celebratory feast.
By taking the provision God gave them and thoroughly enjoying it in his presence.
Exactly. The study notes are careful to point out that while the biblical text universally condemns drunkenness, it actually permits and encourages the consumption of wine and strong drink during these specific, joyful, commemorative occasions before God. He wants them to rejoice in the abundance he has provided.
That completely reframes the concept of devotion. It's essentially saying, I blessed you with this harvest, now take a tenth of it, throw a massive celebration with your family, and remember that I am the source of it all. It's joyous.
It really is.
But, you know, that does bring up a major practical question. If the tithe is largely functioning as a family feast at the sanctuary, how does the actual infrastructure of the society survive?
Right.
How do the religious workers get supported, and how do the poor eat?
That is where the brilliance of the Deuteronomy 14 system really shines, because there is a structural twist built into the timeline. The study Bibles outline this beautifully. Every third year, The entire system of the tithes changes.
Oh, so the focus zooms out from the personal to the communal.
Precisely. Instead of taking that tenth to the central sanctuary for a personal family celebration, the text commands that you must keep all of the tithe of that third year's produce within your local town.
Okay.
You store it up at your own local gates. And the recipients of this localized tithe are very specific.
It lists the Levites, the resident foreigners, the orphans, and the widows. Let's unpack the reality of these groups in the ancient Near East, starting with the Levites.
Yeah, so the Levites were the religious workers, the tribe designated for sanctuary service. Unlike the other tribes of Israel, the Levites were not given a massive territory of land to farm. They relied entirely on the support of the community to survive. Then you have the resident foreigners, the immigrants we discussed earlier, who also typically didn't own land, and finally the orphans and the widows. In an ancient patriarchal society without life insurance, government welfare, or a strong legal advocate, losing a husband or a father meant instant, severe economic devastation.
So the survival of the vulnerable depended entirely on this third-year tithe.
Completely.
For 2 years, the tithe builds your personal connection and joy with God through celebration. But in the third year, the tithe functions as a localized social safety net. It balances personal joy with a deep, structural, communal responsibility.
And the Holman note specifically highlights the economic promise attached to this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the text promises that if the community does this, if they ensure the Levite, the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow are fed and satisfied within their gates, then the Lord will bless them in all the work of their hands. It directly ties God's continued economic blessing of the whole nation to how fiercely they protect and provide for their most vulnerable members.
That is an incredibly holistic system. At the start of this deep dive, we looked at this chapter, and it felt like a chaotic collection of disjointed rules. Don't shave your head for a funeral. Don't eat a rabbit. Don't boil a goat in its mother's milk. Throw a party with your money, but give it all away locally every third year.
It sounds crazy out of context, but when you trace the logical through line, using the historical context and the study notes, the pattern is undeniable. It all stems from that opening identity marker. You are a holy people.
It is a profoundly intentional guide to forging a community, a society that acts like an embassy of a different kingdom. They're entirely distinct in how they process the psychological weight of grief. They are deeply philosophically respectful of the Creator's design and the sanctity of life, even in the daily routine of their diet.
Yeah.
They are commanded to be joyful and celebratory in acknowledging their wealth, and yet structurally fiercely protective of the marginalized people living right next door to them. Every single rule, from the funeral to the dinner plate to the wallet, is a practical outworking of their core identity.
It forces the abstract concept of holiness out of the clouds and into the dirt of everyday life. You can't just claim to be set apart. Your habits have to reflect it.
Which leaves me with a final thought to pose to you listening right now. Something to mull over as you go about the rest of your week. We've seen how Israel's ancient rulebook regulated their mourning, their meals, and their money to tangibly reflect what they valued.
Right.
If someone were to follow you around today and meticulously document your daily habits, exactly how you process grief and hardship, exactly what media and food you consume, and exactly where every dollar of your money flows, what would that personalized rulebook reveal about what you truly worship? It is a provocative mirror to hold up to our modern lives.
That's a powerful question to end on.
Well, that is all the time we have for today's deep dive. We hope this journey through ancient texts has given you a fresh perspective on how the physical and the spiritual are so deeply intertwined. Before we sign off, I want to leave you with this. God blesses all the listeners out there truly. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you on the next deep dive.